Your surname may be carrying a secret, not a small secret, not the kind hidden in an old drawer or whispered at one family dinner. A secret buried in salt air, ship logs, prison ledgers, faded church books, and graves so old that the names are almost gone. Maybe your family has lived in Australia for so long that no one remembers where the story truly began. You know the surname. You have seen it on birthday cards, bills, school forms, and headstones. But you have never stopped to ask one unsettling question. What if that name was already being spoken here before Australia existed as one country? Before the Commonwealth, before the flag, before passports said Australian, before the cities became the cities we know now. Some names arrived in chains. Some came in red coats. Some came carrying Bibles, tools, letters, or stolen goods. And some were carried ashore by people who had no idea that their children and their children's children would spread across a continent. But there is a deeper truth we need to say plainly. Australia did not begin when British ships arrived. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had lived on country for tens of thousands of years, with languages, laws, kinship systems, sacred places, and histories already rooted across this land. This story is about colonial surnames and the strange trail they can leave behind before Australia became one nation in 1901. And one warning before we begin. A surname is a clue. It is not proof. A name can open a locked door, but only records can tell you whether your own family walked through it. So listen closely, because by the end, you will know how to test the story hidden behind your name. Number 10 is Hassall. It does not sound like a name that belongs to danger. But the Hassall story begins with a family heading into the unknown, far from England, far from safety, and far from any promise that they would ever return home. Roland Hassall and his family first traveled into the Pacific as missionaries in the late 18th century. Their path eventually brought them to the young settlement near Sydney, when this place was still raw, uncertain, and painfully small. Imagine what that meant. No tawering skyline, no highways, no suburbs stretching over the horizon. Just rough tracks, thin smoke rising from huts, ships in the harbor, and a settlement trying to decide whether it would survive another year. The Hassall name became part of early Parramatta life. That makes it a powerful clue, especially for families whose oldest known relatives lived around Parramatta, the Hawkesbury, or early Sydney. But the next name carries a colder kind of mystery. It belongs to a man who did not arrive with a family dream. He arrived with military orders. Number 9 is Laycock. Thomas Laycock came to New South Wales in 1791 with the New South Wales Corps. By then, the first shock of settlement had passed, but the colony was still fragile. Food was scarce. Authority was hard. Everyone was watching everyone else. In a place like that, a surname could become more than a name. It could become a signal. Was your ancestor connected to the soldiers who guarded the settlement? Was he linked to stores, land, supplies, or the uneasy power struggles that grew inside early Sydney? The Laycock Trail leads into that tense world, where men in uniform could become farmers, officials, landholders, and figures of influence. But official power was not the only force shaping the colony. Behind the tents and the orders were people trying to keep others alive. And that brings us to number 8. Arndell. Thomas Arndell arrived with the First Fleet as an assistant surgeon. Think about the terror of that role. A crowded ship, disease, injury, hunger, fear, then arrival in a place the British barely understood, with limited supplies and no easy way back. When the First Fleet reached Botany Bay in January 1788, it was not the promised beginning. The location was unsuitable. The ships moved on to Port Jackson, and the settlement began there in hardship and uncertainty. For a family carrying the Arndell name, the clue is not a romantic one. It is medical, practical, and human. It leads to the people who watched sickness, birth, punishment, and death up close in the earliest days. But the next surname brings us to a man who may have stepped onto the shore before almost anyone else. Number 7 is Johnston. George Johnston arrived with the First Fleet as a Marine officer. Tradition says he may have been the first man ashore at Port Jackson. Whether your own family connects to him or not, that image is difficult to shake. A man stands at the edge of a foreign harbor. Behind him, crowded ships. Ahead of him, dark bushland, unfamiliar water, and a future no one can read. Johnston's life became tangled with the life of Esther Abrahams, a woman transported as a convict. Together, their family became part of the colony's early social fabric. That is the hidden pattern in so many old surnames. Behind the official record, there is usually a private story, a relationship, a child, a name passed on quietly, while history looks somewhere else. But then comes a surname that turned punishment into power. Number 6 is Nichols. Isaac Nichols arrived in New South Wales in 1791 as a transported convict. That single fact may have been enough for later generations to hide him from family stories. For a long time, convict ancestry was not always spoken about with pride. But Nichols did not remain only a convict in the records. He became a farmer, a ship owner, a public servant, and the colony's first postmaster. Think about the meaning of that. A man sent across the world as punishment became the person trusted to help manage the mail arriving from that same distant world. Every letter reaching Sydney carried news of the lives left behind. Deaths, marriages, money, forgiveness, or silence. If Nichols appears in your family line, you may be looking at a story of reinvention. But the next surname shows how quickly a single couple could create an entire network across the colony. Number 5 is Small. John Small arrived on the First Fleet as a convict. The surname sounds almost forgettable, but that is exactly why it is so fascinating. In the early colony, small did not always mean insignificant. Small was granted land in 1794. He served as a district constable for years, and his large family formed a web of farms and properties around what is now the Rye district. That is how old Australian ancestry can hide in plain sight. One couple has children. Those children marry into other early families. Their children move a few kilometers down a track, cross a river, take up a farm, appear in a church register, then disappear into another branch of the family tree. 200 years later, the name may survive in a quiet suburb, with no one realizing how close it stands to the beginning. But not every old surname leads to land or prosperity. Some lead to moral pressure, faith, and a settlement trying to make sense of itself. Number 4 is Johnson. Richard Johnson was the chaplain who came at the First Fleet. In a settlement filled with convicts, soldiers, officials, hunger, and conflict, he was expected to bring order to a place that often seemed beyond order. You can picture the scene. Mud underfoot, rough shelters, faces marked by exhaustion. A preacher speaking into wind and rain, trying to give people a reason to believe that this distant outpost could become a community. The Johnson surname is common. That makes it dangerous for family historians. A Johnson in an old record may be your ancestor, or it may be a complete stranger. But that is where the mystery sharpens. The more common the name, the more carefully you must trace it, not by wishful thinking, not by copying someone else's online tree, by dates, places, marriages, witnesses, occupations, and children. Because the next name shows what happens when a convicted man becomes part of the colony's everyday heartbeat. Number 3 is Squire. James Squire arrived on the First Fleet after being convicted in England. In Australia, he became one of the earliest brewers and one of the first people to grow hops successfully. That may sound simple now. Beer, hops, a farm. But in a young colony, nothing was simple. Food was uncertain. Supplies failed. Ships came late, or not at all. Every crop was a gamble. Every successful harvest mattered. Squire's story is not really about beer. It is about comfort in a place built on discomfort. It is about people gathering after hard labor, sharing news, trading stories, making small islands of normal life in a world that was still harsh and unfamiliar. If your surname is Squire, or if it appears in your family tree, it may point toward that fragile moment when the colony began to feel less like a camp and more like a place where people intended to stay. But the next name carries something heavier, a question that hung over the entire colony. Could this place feed itself? Number 2 is Ruse. James Ruse came on the first fleet as a convict, but he became one of the most important symbols of survival in early New South Wales. The colony was hungry. The land was unfamiliar. Crops failed. Rations were cut. Behind every order and every ceremony was a fear that few people wanted to say aloud. What if the settlement simply could not last? Ruse asked for land near Parramatta. He cleared it. He planted. He endured drought, poor soil, shortages, and the crushing pressure of trying to make a farm work when so much depended on it. In 1791, he received the first land grant issued in New South Wales. That detail matters because it changes the way we see his name. Ruse was not just a former convict with a patch of ground. His farm became proof that a smallholder could support himself in this strange new colony. That is why a name can hold more than blood. It can hold a turning point. If Ruse appears in your ancestry, you may be standing near one of the earliest chapters of private farming in Australia. But the final name takes us even deeper into a story of separation, loss, and a court case that changed everything. Number 1 is Kable. Henry Kable and Susanna Holmes were both convicted in England. They were young. They were separated by prison. They had a child. And when they were sent toward the other side of the world, they carried a small parcel of goods that had been gathered for them by people who knew their story. That parcel was supposed to help them begin again. But somewhere during the voyage, it was stolen. Think about what that must have felt like. You're trapped on a ship for months. You have left everything familiar behind. You do not know what waits at the end of the ocean. The few possessions meant to give your family a chance have vanished. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. For Henry and Susanna Kable, it became the beginning of another one. They sued the captain, and they won damages in what became the first civil case heard in New South Wales. Let that sink in. In a penal colony, a place built to punish people, 2 convicts stood before the law and demanded to be heard. That is why the Kable name carries such power. It is not a clean story. Henry later built businesses, owned land, sailed into trade, and became influential. His life had ambition, conflict, success, and moral shadows. Early colonial history is rarely neat, but the Kable story reveals something almost unsettling. People who arrived with nothing could still leave a name so deep in the records that centuries later, descendants and strangers are still following the trail. And now comes the part that matters most. Maybe you carry one of these surnames. Maybe it is Kable, Ruse, Squire, Nichols, Small, Johnston, Arndell, Laycock, Hassall, or Johnson. Or maybe you carry none of them. That does not mean your family story is less important. Australia was shaped by countless names, including names that were misspelled, changed, hidden, lost through marriage, or buried in records nobody has opened for 100 years. But do not let a surname alone convince you. Start with the people you know, your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. Find birth, death, and marriage records. Search passenger lists and convict records. Look for old land grants, church registers, probate files, newspaper notices, cemetery records, and electoral rolls. Then do the hardest thing in family history. Go one generation at a time. Do not jump from your surname today to a famous person in 1788 because the name matches. Prove every parent. Prove every child. Watch for spelling changes. Watch for repeated names. Watch for a family moving from one town to another. And remember this, DNA can support a family story, but it cannot replace the paper trail. The real revelation comes when a document connects one life to the next, until the distance between you and that old name begins to disappear. The lesson is not that every old name belongs to someone famous. The lesson is that history was made by ordinary people under extraordinary pressure. A surname could be the last surviving thread from a life that otherwise vanished from memory. Pull it gently, verify it carefully, and it may lead you somewhere no family story ever did. Sometimes the answer will disappoint you. A cherished surname may belong to another family entirely. That is not failure. It is the point of honest research. The truth is more valuable than a dramatic connection that cannot be proved. And the real story may be waiting one branch away under a maiden name your family stopped using, then forgot generations ago. Because somewhere in an archive, there may be a page waiting for you. A name written in ink. A ship. A sentence. A marriage. A grant of land. A witness at a wedding. A grave. And when you find it, history stops feeling distant. It becomes family. So tell me in the comments, what is your surname? And what is the oldest Australian place your family remembers living? Was it Parramatta? The Hawkesbury? Sydney? Hobart? Norfolk Island? A small town with a cemetery full of names you have never investigated? And if you want more hidden Australian family stories, forgotten surnames, and the secrets locked inside old records, subscribe. Because your family name may not be just a name. It may be a surviving trace of a world that existed before Australia became Australia.